Hey, all right, let's go in depth on this Friday night, shall we? We've been talking a lot about the 2024 elections, and many of you wrote about our segment on polling, so thank you. Keep emailing Dan at WRAL.com. Your feedback and your ideas really do drive this segment. Aaron and Ryan both enjoyed the in-depth segment on polling, or at least a piece of it. Ryan writes, don't think for a second we didn't hear you drop an epic Anchorman reference, and Aaron said, you totally slid an Anchorman reference in there, my favorite movie of all time. So you are listening. I love to hear it. Good catch, fellas. And if you missed that reference, please go back and watch the segment. It's on WRAL.com right now. Just search for In Depth. Mike, though, was a little bit more skeptical about the reporting. He wrote, one thing you said really bothered me. You equated political polling and how people digest that information with how people adjust their behavior with the forecasted weather. The data that is used to create weather models is empirical. The potential for someone to lie can't be overlooked, and therefore polling predictions really need to be taken with a grain of salt. So, Mike, great point. You're right on there on several fronts. The data used for weather forecasting is real, not theoretical. And yes, some people do lie when taking polls, but pollsters know this, and they account for it, at least the ones doing actual scientific polling. See, there is a difference between scientific polls and non-scientific polls. Most of the time, they're pretty easy to differentiate, but not always. For instance, all week, we've been talking about our exclusive WRAL news poll about the 2024 election. That is a scientific poll. We partnered with experts to put that together. But if you ever watch us at 4 o'clock on WRAL, you know we do a segment where we ask questions and you can vote right then and there. That is not scientific. Neither are things like Twitter polls. You know, more than 17 million people have voted on whether Elon Musk should step down from Twitter, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's legit. Those examples are pretty obvious. You probably know that. But sometimes non-scientific polls can be tough to spot. We asked a Stanford professor about this.
And the essence of this is random sampling versus not random sampling. It's really cheap and quick to do a non-random sample poll and much more expensive and time-consuming to do a random sample poll. And we know that random samples are still highly accurate today, and the non-probability, non-random sample polls are not. And yet you often don't know the difference when you see them covered in the news or anywhere else.
A random sample and a non-random sample. There's a huge difference there. Non-random samples, they're typically taken out of convenience. Now, who are the easiest people for researchers to contact? A random sample, though, they make sure that every member of a population being studied has an equal chance of being contacted for that. Basically, whether or not a poll is legit depends big time on who was surveyed and how. It comes down to sampling, weighting, and margin of error. As the professor just said, sampling is really important. You can't poll every single person in the country, we know that, but you also can't walk up to a street corner, for instance, or just post something online, ask a couple hundred people some question, and then call it a day. You have to intentionally include people from all ages, genders, incomes, races, ethnicities, regions, education levels, all that sort of stuff. And some groups can be harder to reach than others, so pollsters use what's called weighting. And here's where the math comes in. You know, that thing that's also used in the science of weather forecasting. We'll keep it simple. Let's say you polled men and women, but you polled more men than women. Let's say 70% were men, 30% were women, but you needed that sample to be 50-50. Well, then you give more weight to the women's responses and less to the men. In this example, the men's responses now count for 0.7 and a woman's response would account for 1.6. Our viewer Mike raised concerns over whether people, though, are really even telling the truth in these polls. It's impossible to know who was truthful and who was not, and that's why scientific polls actually include a margin of error, or a credibility interval, they call it. Oftentimes, it's that teeny tiny text right next to the results, saying something like plus or minus 3%. Basically, that means if you ran a poll 100 times with a different sample of people each time, the overall percentage of people responding the same way would be within 3% of that original result. So you might see a poll that says, I don't know, 48% say they vote Republican and 46% say they vote Democrat. But with a 3% margin of error, that result could actually be just as easily 45 for Republican and 49 for Democrat, switching it there. How do they even get that plus or minus number? Well, you know, more math. A common formula is 1 divided by the square root of the sample size. Get your calculators out. But, if a few people fib on their answers, a scientific poll can actually account for that. I like that Mike was skeptical about our reporting in a healthy way. He came back to the source, asked us a question. Hopefully we sorted it out together. That is the point of this segment. It represents you. It represents all of you, Democrats, Republicans, the in-betweens. Love me or hate me, I will take you and your concerns and your questions seriously. So give me your thoughts at dan@WRAL.com. Tell me what is on your mind, and we will go in depth.